Hi guys, my name's Connor Johnson and this is my Step 262 final. For this lesson, I've decided to do it on Commodore Perry's expedition to Japan, which took place in 1853 and 1854. We'll chop right into it. For my placement this semester, I was put at Greeley West High School with Leah Sanford. With her, I was doing 3 different classes. 2 of them were sociology classes with sophomores and juniors, and then 2 of them were AP/DP US History classes with sophomores, juniors, and seniors. For my mission statement, my students will cultivate strong critical thinking and analytical skills that will help them thrive as adults, as well as develop a growth mindset and a love for continuous lifelong learning with a foundation built on respect and fostering of relationships. For the purposes of this lesson, I think it would fit really well in a AP World History class, either that or an elective course on Asian civs or like a Japanese history course, like a general one. I think that would be a really good fit. For the learning outcomes of this lesson, I want my students to be able to explain why Commodore Perry's expedition was instrumental in altering Japanese history, particularly how it led to the Boshin War, the Meiji Restoration, and then eventually the foreign policy that really put it into World War II. And then I want my students to be able to analyze and infer meaning through the examination of images. And then I want them to be able to relate that meaning or that information back to the greater context of what was happening at the time. So when doing a lesson like this, I think in a unit, having a background information slide wouldn't be necessary, but for this lesson as a standalone, having some background is pretty key. However, for the sake of time, I'm just going to go briefly through it. So Tokugawa Japan, or Tokugawa Japan, was the era that predated Commodore Perry's expedition, and understanding the ideologies and the attitudes towards foreigners that were instilled during that period is kind of key to understand the expedition itself. So it's kind of characterized by two main points. One was their isolationist policy. They were very anti-Western and anti-foreign. And the other was their rigid class structure. The class structure in Japan was basically put into the upper class, which was the warring or the samurai class, with the shogun and the emperor at the top, and then the samurai underneath them. And then there was the lower class, which was made up of the peasantry, like the artisans, the farmers, merchants, that kind of thing, that made up the vast majority of the population. The biggest thing to understand with Tokugawa and the Tokugawa era was it was a unprecedented era of peace. They had 200 years of peace, and that's, while on the surface might seem like a good thing, was problematic because you had a warring ruling class made up of warriors and samurai that had no wars to fight. So as a result, during this peacetime, there's a huge tension buildup because of the prosperity and the power that was being attributed to the peasantry. That was being built up primarily in the merchant class, and then those attitudes towards the power wielding in the samurai and the warring class. So then getting into Commodore Perry's expedition, Commodore Perry was sent over with 6 ships in 1853 by President Fillmore, primarily due to a need for natural resources, in particular coal. At that time, the United States was entering their industrial era, and they needed natural resources to be able to fuel their industry. And Japan had a very rich supply of coal. So in 1853, Commodore Perry sailed 6 ships into Edo Bay and did what was called gunboat diplomacy. He basically opened up his the guns on his ships and pointed them at the imperial palace, and then delivered an ultimatum to the emperor, and said he'll be coming back in a year to hear his response. Essentially, the ultimatum read that they can either open up the country and engage in trade with the United States, or they would suffer military conflict. As a result, the shogun ended up opening up the country. He opened it not only to the U.S., but to Great Britain, Russia, Netherlands, and France as well. And it led to an integration of Western technology in Edo. Edo in particular got quite a bit out of this, but it did also create a division of power due to conflict within the military hierarchy. There were those in power that valued tradition and were incredibly anti-Western, and then there were those who were more open up to experimentation and looking at Western technology and what it could do for Japan. Those tensions ultimately exploded. It was the Boshin War, the Japanese Civil War, which led to the Meiji Restoration, and transformed Japan into a more militaristic republic, if you will. So getting into the actual activity that I would do with this, I really like the idea of using primary sources and images for student engagement. I think it's really rich and something that students don't get to do quite as often. Particularly when you're like working with CLD students or visual learners, using images can be really powerful. It's a really good way to differentiate and kind of work on those barriers that you might have with some of those students. So images like this, I think, are incredibly powerful. Also this one. And I think by using scaffolding and creating a series of questions around these images can be really powerful in terms of helping students learn how to critically think and analyze documents like these. So kind of like looking at what does this image show? What does it not show? What does that say about the Japanese perspective? What other context can we bring into this to kind of help reveal what this picture demonstrates towards the Japanese attitudes towards Commodore Perry or towards Americans in general, and what offers they're bringing, that kind of thing. In addition, I also found 3 different letters. One was from President Fillmore, his letter to Japan, which is what was originally delivered to the Japanese emperor in Commodore Perry's ultimatum. Then you have their response, and then you have another letter by Commodore Perry to the senior counselor Hayashi, which was presented in March 10th of 1854. I think using letters and then having images to back them up and using them together is a really good way to kind of help facilitate this kind of analytical discussion that you can have in your classes. In terms of adaptation and modification to differentiate for students, offering translations for visuals, for letters, or if you have any kind of background information or context that accompanies visuals, having translations can be really good for CLD students or English language learners. You can also put these students in groups if you need to. That could help with ADHD students. It can help CLD learners. When you're working with texts that are verbal, you can read them aloud. That'll help with auditory learning. And then also offering a diversity in response is good. Not always having students, having them write things down or writing their thoughts down, but allowing them to either maybe do a class discussion in groups, like a think, pair, share, or even just individually, maybe drawing pictures, that kind of thing. Just having those options available can make it, one, not only more accessible for students, but I think could also make it a lot more interesting, a lot more fun, kind of raise the motivation and engagement in your classes. So yeah, that's my lesson and my Step 262 final. Hope you enjoyed, and thank you. Have a good rest of your night.